She did not lose her crown. She lost everything that made it matter. No decree was signed. No accusation spoken. And yet the world around her slowly rearranged itself without asking her permission. Faces changed. Voices shifted. And the spaces she once filled began to close quietly. Almost politely. As if nothing had happened at all. Tonight, you will step into a court where power does not fall. It fades. Unnoticed. Until there is nothing left to hold. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at a quiet distance inside a Tudor court, watching not the king, but the people who surrounded his wife, it would become clear that her position was never secured by title alone. It rested quietly and continuously, in the presence of others. Those who chose to stand beside her, speak with her, and be seen near her without hesitation. At first, everything would appear stable. She entered the hall with the same measured steps, her gown struck and deliberate, her place already prepared, heads inclined as she passed. Conversations paused just long enough to acknowledge her presence. Nothing in these movements suggested weakness. Nothing implied that her position could be altered without a visible rupture. And yet, what sustained her was not what could be seen directly, but what moved around her without being named. Family formed the first layer of this structure. Relatives did not merely exist as personal connections. They extended her presence into spaces she could not control. A brother speaking her name carried weight beyond affection. A cousin repeating her words could influence decisions before they reached her ears. Loyalty was not symbolic. It was functional. It ensured that her influence did not end when she left a room. Friends created the second layer. They did not need titles to be effective. Their value lay in proximity and repetition. A familiar face beside her at gatherings reinforced stability. A quiet agreement in conversation protected her from doubt. Even small gestures, such as standing close, speaking often, and listening attentively, contributed to the impression that she remained supported. Without these people, she would still be present, but she would no longer be reinforced. The Tudor court did not operate through declarations. It moved through patterns. Who appeared together? Who spoke to whom? Who was included without effort? These patterns formed a silent language, and within that language, the wife's network translated her presence into influence. Something is unsettling in how fragile this system truly was. A woman could believe that her marriage secured her place, that her title defined her authority. But the court responded not to structure, but to perception, and perception depended on repetition, on being seen, again and again, in the company of those who mattered. If she was surrounded, she remained central. If that surrounding began to thin, even slightly, the meaning of her presence began to change. Not through accusation, through absence, a conversation that did not include her, a gathering where her voice was not echoed, a moment where her name was not repeated by others. These were not events that demanded attention. They were small omissions, easily overlooked, yet deeply consequential. Because in a court built on visibility, absence carried its own message. Her network, then, was not a luxury. It was the structure that allowed her to exist as more than a figure beside her husband. It ensured that her influence extended beyond the immediate, that her presence lingered even when she was no longer physically there. To lose such a network was not to fall suddenly. It was to fade gradually. A relative might leave for reasons that seemed reasonable. A friend might become less available. A servant might be replaced without explanation. Each change, on its own, appeared harmless. Together, they created a distance that could not be easily reversed. What makes this especially difficult to confront is how natural it appears. Nothing is declared, nothing is forced. The court itself provides the perfect cover. People move, priorities shift, alliances evolve. It becomes easy to accept these changes as ordinary, even when they are not. Because in the Tudor court, relationships were not only lived, they were quietly adjusted, and those who understood this did not need to challenge the wife directly. They only needed to influence the space around her, to allow her network to loosen, thread by thread, until it no longer functioned as protection. By the time the change became visible, it was already complete. She would still stand in the same place. She would still hold the same title, but the invisible structure that once carried her presence forward would no longer respond. And in that silence, something essential had already been taken. She remained where she had always been. Yet the network that sustained her had begun to loosen in ways no one openly named. In a court where influence depended on others, the quiet absence of familiar voices could alter her position without a single confrontation. And as that absence settled in, something else began to take shape around her. Something that would decide who truly held power. The wife's influence did not rest in what she declared, but in what others repeated on her behalf. It moved quietly through corridors she did not walk, carried in voices that sounded familiar enough to be trusted, yet distant enough to avoid direct association. What appeared to be her authority was, in truth, a distributed presence, sustained by those who chose to remain within her orbit. Noble connections formed the outer frame of this influence. They gave her reach. A name spoken within the right lineage could travel further than any instruction she issued herself. Relatives positioned across different factions ensured that her presence extended into conversations she never witnessed. Their alignment with her did not need to be announced. It was understood through proximity, through repeated association, through the simple fact that they continued to stand near her when it mattered. These relationships maintained continuity. They ensured that her influence did not dissolve between appearances. Even when she was absent, her position remained active, circulating through those who carried her interests forward. A discussion held in a private chamber might still reflect her preferences, not because she demanded it, but because those present anticipated her stance. This anticipation was a form of control. It allowed her to shape outcomes without direct involvement, and because it remained indirect, it was difficult to challenge. No one could point to a single moment where she exerted pressure. No one could accuse her of overreach. Yet her presence was felt consistently, in decisions that appeared to form on their own, closer to her. A second layer operated with greater subtlety. Friends and trusted companions did not hold formal power, but they shaped perception. They listened more than they spoke. They observed shifts in tone, conversation hesitation, and small changes in behavior that signaled deeper movements beneath the surface. What they gathered was rarely written, rarely confirmed, but it was often accurate. They became her eyes, not in a way that suggested surveillance, but in a manner that allowed her to remain informed without appearing to seek information. A casual remark overheard at a gathering could reveal more than an official report. A change in who stood beside whom could indicate a shift in loyalty before it was openly acknowledged. These observations, repeated and shared carefully, formed a quiet intelligence network. It did not announce itself. It did not require structure. Yet it functioned with a precision that formal systems could not match. It allowed the wife to anticipate rather than react, to adjust her behavior before circumstances forced her to do so. And because it relied on trust, it appeared natural. Those who participated did not necessarily see themselves as agents of influence. They were friends, relatives, companions, moving within the court as they always had. But their presence, their attention, and their willingness to remain aligned created a system that reinforced her position at every level. There is something almost imperceptible about how this reinforcement works. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself through visible displays of loyalty. Instead, it accumulates through repetition. The same faces appear beside her. The same voices are supporting her in conversation. The same patterns of association form again and again until they become expected. Expectation, in the Tudor court, carried weight. When people expected her to be supported, they treated her as if she already was. When they saw her surrounded, they assumed stability, and that assumption shaped their behavior, encouraging alignment, discouraging challenge, and reinforcing her position without the need for direct assertion. This is how legitimacy was maintained, not through law alone, but through presence made visible and repeated. The wife's network ensured that she was not seen as isolated, not perceived as vulnerable, not interpreted as uncertain. Even small gestures contributed to this effect. A companion stepping closer, a relative speaking her name, a group forming naturally around her in a crowded hall. Each moment was minor. Together, they were decisive, because once that collective presence existed, it became difficult to question her position without also questioning those who stood with her. And in a court where alliances were fragile, few were willing to risk that kind of disruption. Her power, then, did not reside in confrontation. It resided in reinforcement, a system that required no declaration, no defense, and no visible effort, only the continued presence of those who chose, again and again, to remain within her circle. Her influence did not come from what she controlled directly, but from the network that carried her presence beyond her own reach. Through repeated proximity and quiet observation, that network turned perception into stability without ever drawing attention to itself. And once that stability began to shift, even slightly, it would reveal how easily influence could be redirected without a single word being spoken. The presence of a well-supported wife did not invite confrontation. It discouraged it. Those who observed her position closely understood that her strength did not lie in her alone, but in the people who surrounded her, repeated her presence, and reinforced her legitimacy without pause. To challenge her openly would not only provoke resistance, but also expose the one who dared to do so. And exposure, in a court governed by perception, was often more dangerous than defeat. The mistress, if she were perceptive, would recognize this immediately. She would not mistake proximity to the king as sufficient protection. Favor could shift. Affection could cool. What endured, far more reliably, was structure. And the wife, supported by a network that extended through family, companions, and quiet alliances, possessed a structure that could not be dismantled through simple opposition. To move against her directly would be to collide with that structure. And collisions, in such a space, were rarely survived intact. So the approach changed. Not outwardly, not in any way that could be named or traced, but in intention. The objective was no longer to confront the wife as an individual. It was to alter the environment in which she existed, to weaken the network that sustained her, until her position no longer carried the same weight it once did. This required patience, because the network itself was not fragile. It had been formed over time, reinforced through repetition, and maintained through shared interest. It could not be removed without consequence. It could only be adjusted, slowly, carefully, and without drawing attention. The first step was recognition, to understand not who the wife was, but how she was supported, which relationships were essential, and which were merely visible, who spoke for her in her absence, who listened closely when she spoke, who stood near her without hesitation, and who might step away if given reason. These distinctions were subtle, but they mattered, Because not every connection needed to be severed, only the right ones needed to be softened. The process did not begin with removal. It began with distance. A conversation that once included her might begin without her presence. A gathering that once formed naturally around her might shift slightly, creating space where there had been none before. Those who once aligned themselves closely with her might find themselves drawn, gently, toward other circles. Circles that appeared just as stable, just as legitimate, but centered elsewhere. No one was instructed to move. They simply found themselves moving. And because these movements were small, they did not appear deliberate. They could be explained, justified, ignored. Each shift, taken alone, was insignificant. But together, they began to alter the pattern that had once reinforced the wife's position. Her network did not disappear. It loosened, and in that loosening, its strength diminished. What makes this particularly effective is that it avoids resistance. There is nothing to oppose, because nothing is openly done. The wife cannot confront distance. She cannot be accused of absence. To do so would risk appearing unstable, overly sensitive, or disconnected from the natural flow of court life. And in a place where perception defines reality, such impressions could be as damaging as any direct attack. So she remains still. She continues as she always has, trusting that what once supported her will continue to do so. But the structure beneath that trust has already begun to change. Meanwhile, the mistress does not need to act visibly. Her influence operates through alignment rather than confrontation. By encouraging new connections and by reinforcing alternative centers of attention, she allows the court to adjust itself. The wife's network is not broken, it is replaced, piece by piece, by something that functions differently. This replacement is not immediate. It unfolds gradually, allowing each change to settle before the next begins. There is no moment where the balance shifts entirely, only a series of adjustments that, over time, produce a new equilibrium. And by the time this equilibrium is established, the original structure no longer holds. The wife remains supported, but not in the same way. Her allies are still present, but not as close. Her voice is still heard, but not as often. Nothing has been taken from her directly. And yet, something essential has already been lost. This is the nature of isolation when it is used as a strategy. It does not begin with exclusion. It begins with recognition, with the understanding that power, when it is distributed through others, can be redirected without ever touching the person who appears to hold it. She was not confronted, not challenged, and not removed. Yet the network that once protected her had begun to loosen in ways she could not clearly name. Those who understood the court did not attack her position. They adjusted the space around it until her support no longer held the same weight. As that support thinned, the first visible signs began to appear, subtle changes that suggested something was quietly slipping out of place. At first, nothing appears to have been removed. The halls remain as they were. The same candles burn along the walls. The same voices fill the space with low, measured conversation. Music continues without interruption, and the movement of the court follows its familiar rhythm. To an untrained eye, nothing has changed. Everything continues, precisely as before. Only the people begin to feel different. The invitations arrive less frequently, not absent, just fewer. A gathering she once attended without question now proceeds without her presence. No explanation is offered. None is expected. The absence is small enough to ignore, easy enough to excuse. Perhaps the guest list was limited. Perhaps the occasion required a different arrangement. Perhaps it was simply an oversight. Each possibility is reasonable. And that is what makes it difficult to resist. Because nothing has been taken directly. There is nothing to confront. No one has denied her entry. No one has spoken against her. The court has not closed its doors. It has only shifted its attention slightly toward other centers. The effect is quiet. Those who once stood close begin to hold a careful distance. Not enough to signal disloyalty. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to create space where none existed before. A familiar companion might linger at the edge of a conversation rather than at her side. A relative might engage elsewhere. Their focus divided in ways that feel new, though not immediately suspicious. These movements are subtle. They do not announce themselves. And because they remain incomplete, they can always be explained away. A delay in greeting, a shortened exchange, a moment where eye contact is avoided rather than held. None of these moments demands acknowledgement. They pass quickly, leaving behind only a faint impression that something is not as it once was. And because each impression is slight, it becomes difficult to determine whether the change is real or simply imagined. This uncertainty settles in quietly. The wife continues to move through the court as she always has. She takes her place. She speaks when addressed. She maintains the same composure, the same presence, the same visible structure that once ensured stability. Nothing in her behavior suggests loss. And yet, something no longer responds. The people who once reinforced her presence do not gather in the same way. Conversations do not expand around her as they once did. The ease with which she was included begins to tighten, replaced by a careful, measured politeness that offers acknowledgement without closeness. She is still recognized, but she is no longer absorbed into the center of attention. What makes this especially difficult to confront is that it does not occur all at once. There is no moment of realization, no clear point where the change becomes undeniable. Instead, it accumulates through repetition. A missed invitation becomes another. A distant exchange becomes expected. A familiar presence becomes an occasional one. And over time, absence begins to feel normal. The court does not reject her. It adjusts around her. Those who once aligned themselves closely with her begin to orient themselves elsewhere. Not abruptly, not decisively, but gradually, in ways that allow them to maintain appearances while altering their position. They remain within sight, but no longer within reach. This distance carries no accusation. It requires no explanation. And because it is never declared, it cannot be directly challenged. To question it would be to give it form. To name it would be to risk appearing unsettled, overly aware of something that others treat as insignificant. And in a place where composure defines credibility, such awareness can be turned against her. So she remains still. She continues as before, trusting that what has shifted will return, that what has loosened will tighten again. But the pattern has already begun to change. And patterns, once altered, rarely return to their original form without intention. The most unsettling part is not the absence itself. It is the uncertainty that surrounds it. Because she cannot identify a single cause, she cannot respond with certainty. There is no one to confront, no event to correct, no moment to reverse. Only a series of small changes that, taken together, suggest that something is moving beyond her control. And by the time that realization begins to take shape, the familiar faces that once defined her world have already begun to disappear into other circles. The court still moved as it always had. Yet the familiar faces that once gathered around her had begun to fade without explanation. Through missed invitations and quiet distance, her presence remained visible but no longer central to the rhythm of those around her. Somewhere within that quiet shift, a new arrangement was forming, one that would determine who stood close and who would be left standing alone. The change rarely begins with those who stand beside her in public. It begins with those who stand behind her in private. Servantes, attendants, and ladies in waiting do not appear to hold power. They do not speak in council, do not command attention in the great hall, do not shape policy in any visible way. And yet, they control something far more immediate: the flow of daily life, the movement of information, the boundaries of what is seen and what is kept hidden. For the wife, these people are not simply part of her household. They are the structure through which she understands her world. A trusted attendant knows when a message arrives before it is announced. A lady in waiting hears the tone of a conversation before its content is repeated. A servant notices who enters a corridor, who lingers near a door, and who leaves without being seen. These observations, small and constant, form a quiet awareness that allows the wife to remain informed without appearing to seek knowledge. When these people are loyal, the system works without strain. Information reaches her naturally. Delays are minimal. Conversations are relayed with accuracy. The atmosphere around her remains stable, predictable, and familiar. She does not need to question what she hears, because trust fills the space between observation and understanding. This is why they are replaced carefully, not dismissed all at once, not removed in ways that would invite attention. One attendant is reassigned for reasons that appear reasonable. Another is replaced due to efficiency. A new face is introduced, presented as capable, reliable, and unobtrusive. Each change, on its own, is small enough to accept. Together, they begin to alter the structure that once supported her awareness. The new servants do not behave differently in any obvious way. They perform their duties. They respond when called. They maintain the same outward discipline expected of them. Nothing in their conduct invites suspicion. And yet, something within their presence feels altered. Information arrives differently. Messages are delayed, though never entirely withheld. Conversations are reported, but with less detail, less certainty. Small gaps begin to appear. Moments where something should have been known earlier, where a tone should have been noticed, where a presence should have been acknowledged. These gaps are difficult to define. They do not disrupt the system entirely. They only weaken it. And because the weakening is gradual, it is easily overlooked. At the same time, the new attendants observe more than they reveal. They move quietly, but with attention. They remain close enough to hear, but distant enough to avoid involvement. Their presence does not interrupt the wife's routine, but it begins to shape it. Rooms feel slightly less private. Conversations feel slightly more measured. Words are chosen with greater care, not because of any clear threat, but because something within the space no longer feels entirely contained. This is how surveillance begins to take form, not as an intrusion, as awareness. The wife cannot point to a specific moment where she is being watched. No one follows her openly. No one questions her directly. And yet, the sense of being observed settles into her surroundings, altering how she moves, how she speaks, how she thinks. Her room, once a place of control, begins to feel shared, not physically occupied, but quietly permeable. What she says may travel further than intended. What she does may be repeated in ways she cannot predict. The boundary between private and public, once clear, begins to blur. And in that uncertainty, she begins to adjust her behavior. She speaks less freely. She pauses more often. She considers not only what is said, but how it might be heard. These adjustments do not protect her. They restrict her, because the information she once received with ease no longer arrives with the same clarity. She begins to rely on what remains. Partial knowledge replaces certainty. Delayed messages replace immediate awareness. And in that delay, decisions are made without her input. Conversations unfold without her presence, and opportunities pass without her recognition. The structure of her household still exists, but it no longer serves her in the same way. What makes this transformation particularly effective is that it does not require confrontation. The wife cannot accuse her attendants without evidence. She cannot reject them without reason. To do so would risk appearing unstable, distrustful, or disconnected from the order expected of her position. So she adapts. She continues to move within a system that no longer fully responds to her, adjusting herself to its changes rather than resisting them. And in doing so, she begins to lose the very awareness that once allowed her to remain secure. Her household has not been taken from her. It has been reoriented. And within that reorientation, her control becomes increasingly uncertain. The faces within her private rooms had changed, yet their presence remained calm enough to avoid suspicion while quietly altering what she could see and understand. Through small delays and careful observation, the flow of information shifted, leaving her aware of less while feeling observed more. Within that quiet imbalance, something deeper began to take hold, something that would make even her own space feel no longer entirely her own. Placement, rather than speech, becomes the first visible sign that something has begun to change. No announcement is made. No instruction is spoken aloud. Yet the arrangement of bodies within the great hall starts to follow a different pattern, one that quietly redirects attention without ever appearing to break the structure that holds it together. The hall itself remains familiar. Long tables extend across the room with the same measured symmetry. Candles burn steadily, casting a consistent glow over polished surfaces and composed faces. Servants move with the same discipline, and conversations rise and fall in the same restrained rhythm. Nothing in the setting suggests disruption. Only the positioning begins to shift. A seat once placed among those who reinforced the wife's presence is moved, slightly, into a space that does not carry the same weight. It is not distant enough to imply exclusion. It is not altered enough to provoke attention. It simply changes the direction of proximity, and with it, the direction of influence. Those who once gathered naturally around her are no longer arranged in the same way. A familiar ally appears further along the table, engaged in a conversation that does not reach her. Another is positioned at an angle where their attention is divided, no longer aligned with hers by default. The group that once formed a quiet circle of reinforcement now disperses into smaller, less connected clusters. No one is removed. They are simply redistributed. This redistribution alters more than seating. It reshapes how interaction occurs. Conversations that once expanded outward from her position now originate elsewhere. Attention gathers in new places, forming centers that do not depend on her presence to remain active. What once required her involvement now proceeds without it. Quietly and efficiently, she remains within the space. But the space no longer responds to her in the same way. Public appearances follow a similar adjustment. Gatherings that once included her as a central figure begin to unfold with a different emphasis. She is still invited, but not always positioned where visibility naturally collects. She attends, yet finds herself observing rather than directing. Present, but no longer integrated into the flow that defines importance. Nothing in this process appears deliberate. Each change can be explained. A shift in seating is attributed to protocol. A different arrangement is justified by precedence. A variation in attendance is accepted as a necessity. These explanations are sufficient. Because they are sufficient, they are not questioned. Formality provides the perfect cover. When behavior is governed by ritual, even deliberate adjustments appear natural. The wife cannot challenge where she is placed without challenging the system itself. To question her position would be to question the order that defines her role. And such questioning risks drawing attention in ways that weaken rather than restore authority. So she accepts. She takes her place as it is given. She moves within the structure as it presents itself. And with each acceptance, the new arrangement becomes more stable, more familiar, more difficult to reverse. Those around her adapt as well. They sit where they are directed. They speak with those nearest to them. Their attention follows proximity, and proximity no longer centers on her. Over time, This alignment reshapes the entire flow of interaction, redirecting influence toward those who now occupy the most connected positions. The effect is cumulative. Each gathering reinforces the new pattern. Each seating confirms the altered structure. Each moment of distance becomes easier to accept, easier to overlook, easier to interpret as part of the ordinary movement of court life. Gradually, expectation begins to change. Observers no longer anticipate her involvement in the same way. Her presence is acknowledged, but not sought. Her voice is heard, but not extended. She remains visible, yet no longer functions as the point through which attention naturally passes. This transformation does not require confrontation. It does not depend on removal. It operates through repetition. By the time the pattern is recognized, it has already settled into place. What once felt unusual begins to feel inevitable. What once required explanation becomes routine. The court continues, as it always has. Yet its internal logic has shifted, redistributing influence without altering the appearance of stability. She is still there. Her title remains unchanged. Her access has not been denied. And yet, the meaning of her position has been quietly rewritten through the management of space. Because in the Tudor court, placement is not incidental. Where one sits, where one stands, and who stands nearby are not minor details. They are signals, repeated, observed, and interpreted without being spoken. They define who is central, who is peripheral, and who no longer shapes the movement of the room. Once those signals change, even slightly, the structure of influence changes with them. And once that structure changes, it rarely returns to what it once was. Her position remained visible, yet the space around her had been rearranged in ways that quietly redirected attention elsewhere. Through repeated placement and subtle distance, her presence no longer guided the flow of interaction as it once had. In that quiet shift, a new center had begun to emerge, one that would determine who remained close enough to matter. Suspicion does not need to be declared to exist. It begins as a suggestion, quiet, incomplete, and carefully placed within conversations that appear too ordinary to carry consequence. No accusation is made. No name is spoken with intent. And yet, something enters the air, something subtle enough to avoid resistance, but persistent enough to remain. The wife is not described as dangerous. She is described as influenced. This distinction matters. To call her disloyal would invite defense. To suggest she is being guided, shaped, or quietly misled introduces uncertainty without confrontation. It allows doubt to form without requiring evidence. And in a court where perception travels faster than truth, uncertainty is often enough. A question is raised, not answered. Someone wonders, gently, whether her decisions are entirely her own. Another remarks, with hesitation, that her recent behavior feels slightly altered. The observation is not repeated with insistence. It is left incomplete, allowed to settle in the mind of the listener, where it can be reshaped and carried forward. This is how suspicion moves, not as a statement, but as a pattern. Those who hear it do not repeat it exactly. They adjust it, soften it, present it as their own impression rather than something they were told. And because it appears to originate from multiple sources, it gains a kind of quiet legitimacy that direct accusation rarely achieves. The wife does not hear these conversations, but she begins to feel their effect. Her interactions shift in tone. A companion who once responded with ease now listens more carefully, as if measuring her words. A familiar ally pauses before agreeing, choosing their responses with a precision that did not exist before. Even silence begins to carry meaning, suggesting hesitation where none had been perceived. This hesitation spreads outward. It reaches her network. Those who once supported her without question begin to consider the cost of that support. Not openly, not in ways they would admit, but in small adjustments that alter their behavior. They speak less frequently on her behalf. They repeat her words with less certainty. They align themselves with her more cautiously, as if proximity itself now requires justification. No one withdraws entirely. They reposition themselves. Because the suspicion does not target them directly, it creates a space where retreat feels like caution rather than betrayal. To remain close might suggest alignment with whatever influence is being implied. To step slightly away offers safety without requiring explanation. And so the network begins to thin, not through removal, but through hesitation. The most effective part of this process is that it appears reasonable. No one is accused of disloyalty. No one is forced to choose sides. Each individual responds to what feels like a subtle shift in the atmosphere, adjusting their position in ways that seem justified, even necessary. And because these adjustments are made independently, they do not appear coordinated. They appear natural. This naturalness protects the source of the suspicion. There is no origin that can be identified, no single voice that can be challenged. The suggestion exists everywhere and nowhere at once. It cannot be confronted because it has no fixed form. It cannot be disproven because it has not been clearly stated. The wife, at the center of this, cannot respond. To deny influence would be to acknowledge the suspicion. To question it would be to give it structure. And in doing so, she risks reinforcing the very doubt she cannot name. Her silence, once a sign of composure, begins to carry a different interpretation. It becomes distant. It becomes uncertain. It becomes, in the minds of others, confirmation. What once defined her strength, her ability to remain composed, to move without visible reaction, now works against her. The more she maintains control, the more she appears removed. The more she avoids confrontation, the more she seems to conceal something. Her network feels this shift. Allies who once relied on her stability now perceive ambiguity. They cannot identify a single cause, but they sense a change. And in a court where perception defines alignment, that sense is enough to alter behavior. Support becomes conditional. Presence becomes measured. Loyalty becomes quiet. Over time, the wife is not abandoned. She is approached with caution. And in that caution, the reinforcement that once sustained her begins to weaken. Because influence does not require certainty to spread. It only requires doubt. Her position had not been challenged directly, yet a quiet uncertainty had begun to surround her, shaping how others perceived her without ever being clearly spoken. Through suggestion and hesitation, her allies remained near, but no longer aligned with the same certainty as before. From that uncertainty, something more fragile began to take hold, something that would make even loyalty feel like a risk. Silence, when it settles across a court, rarely feels like absence. It feels like a restraint. No voices are raised. No accusations are spoken aloud. Conversations continue, measured and controlled, moving from one subject to another with the same composure that has always defined court life. Nothing, on the surface, suggests hostility. Nothing signals that anything has gone wrong. And yet, something has changed. No one speaks against the wife. That is what makes it difficult to recognize. There are no rumors openly repeated. No criticisms voiced in crowded halls. No visible attempts to diminish her standing. Her name is still spoken, but without the same weight. Her presence is still acknowledged, but without the same warmth. Each interaction appears correct, appropriate, and carefully contained. The difference lies not in what is said, it lies in what is withheld. Eyes no longer linger in the same way. Where attention once settled naturally upon her, it now shifts, subtly, almost instinctively, toward other figures. A glance that would have been held is now redirected. A moment of recognition becomes brief, passing quickly before it can form a connection. These movements are small, almost imperceptible, but they repeat, and repetition gives them meaning. Those who stand near her do not step away. They simply do not step closer. Distance is maintained without being declared. No one refuses her presence. No one avoids her openly. But the ease that once defined proximity has been replaced by a careful neutrality. A balance that keeps her within view while ensuring she is no longer the focus. This neutrality spreads. It moves through the court without direction, carried by observation rather than instruction. Each person notices the behavior of others. Each adjusts in response. No one leads the change. And yet the change continues, expanding quietly across the space. The effect is gradual, so gradual that it resists recognition. A single moment can be dismissed. A brief hesitation can be explained. An altered glance can be ignored. But when these moments accumulate, they begin to form a pattern, one that does not announce itself, but cannot be entirely overlooked. Still, it remains unnamed, because to name it would be to disrupt the silence. And silence, in this context, is not empty. It is structured. It allows suspicion to exist without accusation. It permits distance without conflict. It creates an environment where change can occur without resistance. Precisely because it does not demand acknowledgement, the wife moves within this silence. She continues as she always has, maintaining composure, preserving routine, holding to the structure that once ensured her position. Nothing in her behavior reveals uncertainty. Nothing suggests that she has recognized what is happening. And yet, something in her surroundings no longer responds as it once did. Conversations include her, but do not extend beyond her. Presence acknowledges her, but does not gather around her. Recognition occurs, but does not deepen into connection. These are not acts of exclusion. They are absences of engagement. What makes them powerful is that they cannot be confronted. There is no action to oppose, no word to deny, no moment to correct. The silence that surrounds her offers no entry point for response. To challenge it would be to break the very composure that defines her role, risking the appearance of instability in a space where control is expected. So she remains within it. She adapts, subtly, to the changed atmosphere. She speaks less freely. She observes more carefully. She measures her interactions, adjusting to a space that no longer moves toward her, but around her. In doing so, she begins to participate in her own isolation, not by choice, but by necessity, because the silence does not force her away. It simply allows the court to continue without needing her in the same way. Over time, this becomes the new condition. No conflict, no confrontation, no visible shift. Only a quiet redefinition of presence. And in that redefinition, the wife remains where she has always been, yet no longer occupies the same place within the court's attention. Nothing was spoken against her. Yet the silence around her had begun to alter how every glance and gesture was received. Through withheld attention and careful neutrality, the court continued unchanged, while quietly adjusting its distance from her. Out of that silence, a deeper form of isolation began to take hold, one that no one could point to. Yet everyone seemed to follow. Distance, when it is formalized, no longer appears as distance. It appears as an arrangement. No one speaks of removal. No one suggests separation as an act of strategy. Instead, marriages are proposed, alliances are formed, and decisions are presented as opportunities. Natural, even beneficial, for all involved. The language is careful. The intentions remain unstated. And yet, The effect is unmistakable. The wife's network begins to move away from her. Not in defiance. In compliance. A relative is offered a match that promises stability, advancement, or protection. The union appears advantageous, difficult to refuse without consequence. It carries the weight of approval, the suggestion of favor, the quiet pressure that accompanies opportunity in a court where refusal is rarely without cost. The marriage is accepted, and with that acceptance, distance becomes permanent. The relative leaves the court, or remains within it under a different alignment, no longer positioned to reinforce the wife's presence. Their loyalty, once immediate and visible, becomes conditional, redirected through new obligations that take precedence over previous ties. This process repeats, one connection at a time. Each departure is justified. Each alliance appears reasonable. No single change is large enough to attract concern. But together, they alter the structure that once surrounded the wife, reducing its reach, weakening its cohesion, and redistributing its influence across spaces she does not control. Her family, once a source of strength, becomes dispersed, not broken, reassigned. The most effective aspect of this strategy is that it creates new centers of loyalty. Those who marry into different alliances do not abandon their wives entirely. They remain connected, but their position shifts. Their primary obligations now lie elsewhere, within networks that do not depend on her presence to function. Their influence, once aligned with hers, begins to operate independently, and often in ways that no longer reinforce her position. These new alliances form structures that exclude her naturally, not through intention that can be identified, but through the simple fact that she is no longer central to them. Conversations occur without her input. Decisions are shaped without her influence. Relationships develop that do not require her involvement to remain stable. She is not denied access. She is simply not included. This exclusion does not appear hostile. It appears logical, because the alliances that now exist have their own priorities, their own directions, their own centers of attention. The wife, once a focal point, becomes peripheral within these new arrangements. Present in name, but absent in function. Her family reflects this change. Where once it stood as a unified extension of her influence, it now appears fragmented, its members distributed across different interests, each aligned with structures that do not depend on her to maintain their position. From the outside, the family still exists. Its name remains intact. Its presence is still recognized. But its power has shifted. It no longer moves as one. And without that unity, its ability to reinforce her position diminishes. What makes this especially difficult to resist is that it is framed as progress. Each marriage offers advancement. Each alliance promises security. Each decision appears to strengthen the individuals involved. To question these arrangements would be to oppose opportunity, to resist movement, to appear unwilling to adapt within a court that rewards flexibility. So the wife does not resist. She accepts the changes as they are presented. She acknowledges the advantages. She allows the structure around her to adjust, trusting that what remains will continue to support her as it once did. But what remains is not the same. The network has not disappeared. It has been redistributed into forms that no longer reinforce her position directly. And in that redistribution, her influence begins to narrow. She still holds her title. She still occupies her place. But the reach that once extended through her family into the broader court begins to contract, leaving her more dependent on what remains immediately around her, less supported, more exposed, all without a single act that could be named as removal. Because this is how isolation operates when it is formalized, not through separation that is forced, through connections that are redirected. Her family remained present in name, yet its members had been quietly repositioned into alliances that no longer reinforced her place at the center, through marriages that appeared beneficial. Her network was dispersed into structures that moved without her influence. From that quiet redistribution, a new reality began to settle, one in which her strength no longer extended as far as it once had. Reputation, once unsettled, does not collapse all at once. It begins with something small, a detail that feels too minor to defend, too uncertain to deny, and too vague to confront directly. No accusation is made. No formal claim is spoken. Instead, a tone changes. A remark lingers. A question appears where certainty once existed. The wife is not described as improper. She is described as questionable. This distinction allows doubt to move without resistance. A moment from a gathering is mentioned in passing. Her expression, her silence, the way she responded to someone of rank, nothing is stated as fact. The observation remains incomplete, presented as something that might be misunderstood, something that others are free to interpret. And interpretation is where influence takes hold. Those who hear such remarks do not repeat them as accusations. They repeat them as impressions. A hesitation enters their voice. A slight uncertainty shapes how they describe her. Over time, these impressions accumulate, forming a quiet narrative that no one fully owns. Yet many begin to accept. The behavior itself does not need to change. Only the way it is seen. A gesture once understood as restraint becomes distance. A pause once read as composure becomes calculation. A silence, once respected, becomes suspicious. Nothing new has occurred. Only the meaning has shifted. This shift is reinforced through public settings. The court, with its constant observation, provides the perfect environment for such adjustments. Every movement is seen. Every interaction is noted. And when perception begins to change, even familiar actions take on a different weight. The wife enters a room as she always has, but the way she is received feels altered. A greeting is returned, but without warmth. A conversation includes her, but does not expand. Attention acknowledges her presence, but does not remain fixed upon her. These differences are slight, yet they repeat, and repetition transforms them into expectation. Others begin to adjust accordingly. Those within her network recognize the change, though they may not fully understand its source. They sense that her presence carries a new kind of risk. Not immediate, not defined, but present enough to influence behavior. To remain closely aligned with her begins to feel like a decision that requires consideration. And in a court where reputation determines position, consideration often leads to caution. Her allies do not withdraw openly. They reposition themselves. A companion speaks less frequently on her behalf. A relative chooses not to defend her in certain conversations. A supporter remains present, but avoids extending her influence beyond what feels safe. These adjustments are small, almost imperceptible, yet they accumulate into distance. Distance, in this context, is protective. It allows those around her to maintain association without sharing in whatever uncertainty now surrounds her. It offers a way to remain connected without becoming involved. And because this behavior appears reasonable, it spreads without resistance. No one wants to be linked to what cannot be clearly defined. This is how moral perception becomes a tool. It does not need to establish guilt. It only needs to suggest the possibility of it. Once that possibility exists, it begins to shape decisions. Where people stand, what they say, and how closely they align themselves with the one who is being observed differently. The wife cannot easily respond. To defend herself against something undefined would give it form. To deny what has not been stated would create the impression that there is something to deny. And in doing so, she risks reinforcing the very uncertainty that now surrounds her. So she remains composed. She continues to act within the boundaries expected of her, maintaining the same restraint, the same measured presence that once ensured her stability. But the meaning of those actions has already shifted, and she cannot control how they are now interpreted. Her network feels this shift. It does not break. It tightens, becoming more cautious, more selective, and more aware of how the association might be perceived. And in that caution, the strength of her network begins to diminish, not through loss, but through restraint. Because influence depends not only on presence, but on confidence. And once confidence is replaced by hesitation, even the strongest connections begin to weaken. The wife remains where she has always been. Her position is unchanged, but the moral lens through which she is viewed has been adjusted. And that adjustment reshapes how every interaction unfolds around her. Nothing had been proven against her. Yet the way she was perceived had begun to shift through small, repeated suggestions that no one fully claimed. As her actions were reinterpreted in public view, those around her responded with caution, choosing distance over certainty. Out of that caution, a quiet pressure began to spread, one that would make even the closest connections feel increasingly uncertain. Gatherings rarely disappear. They change. The same rooms are used. The same candles are lit. The same rituals of arrival and departure continue without interruption. Music fills the space as it always has, and voices rise in controlled patterns that suggest familiarity rather than disruption. Nothing, at first glance, appears altered. Only the composition begins to shift. Invitations still circulate, but not in the same way. A private supper is arranged without her name included. A smaller gathering forms in a side chamber, attended by those who once would have appeared at her side. These events are not announced broadly. They are framed as informal, limited, or necessary for reasons that seem reasonable. No one declares her absence. It is simply accepted. Because each gathering is small, it does not attract attention. Because it is private, it does not require explanation. And because it occurs more than once, it begins to establish a pattern that quietly reshapes how presence is distributed within the court. The wife remains part of the larger structure, but she is no longer included in its most active moments. Meanwhile, another pattern develops. The king is seen in conversation with a different group. Faces that, while familiar, were not previously central to his daily interactions. These meetings are not formal audiences. They do not carry the weight of official decisions, yet they occur with increasing frequency, creating a space where influence begins to gather outside the established arrangement. Those who attend understand the significance, not because it is declared, but because it is repeated. To be present in these smaller gatherings is to be seen, to be heard, to participate in conversations that may not be recorded, yet carry implications that extend beyond the room. And as these gatherings continue, they begin to function as an alternative center of interaction, one that does not require the wife's presence to remain active. She is not excluded publicly. She is bypassed privately. This distinction allows the process to unfold without resistance. The court, observing these shifts, begins to adjust. Those who once aligned themselves closely with the wife now divide their attention. Some attend the new gatherings, balancing their presence between what remains visible and what is becoming influential. Others, more cautious, observe from a distance, waiting to see where stability will settle. No one moves abruptly. They reposition themselves gradually, and in doing so, they contribute to the formation of a new structure. The wife continues to attend public events. She appears as she always has, maintaining composure, fulfilling her role, and occupying the place that remains formally hers. Nothing in her behavior suggests absence. Nothing in the structure denies her position. Yet the energy within these gatherings feels altered. Conversations do not extend toward her in the same way. Attention does not gather around her with the same ease. She is acknowledged, but not engaged. What once felt natural now feels arranged. The difference is subtle, but persistent. She stands within the space, yet not at its center. She listens, yet does not shape the direction of the discussion. Her presence is visible, but no longer defines the flow of interaction. And because this change is not declared, it cannot be directly addressed. The most effective aspect of this transformation is the image it creates. Not through accusation, through contrast, the wife appears increasingly separate, not removed, not rejected, but positioned in a way that suggests distance. She stands slightly apart, her interactions measured, her presence contained within the formal boundaries of her role. Around her, movement continues, but it does not converge. This image repeats. Each gathering reinforces it. Each arrangement confirms it. And over time, it becomes an accepted representation of her position. Present, yet not central, visible, yet not influential. Those who observe begin to internalize this pattern. They no longer expect her to lead the conversation. They no longer look to her for direction. Her presence becomes part of the setting rather than a force that shapes it. And once this perception settles, it influences behavior in ways that extend beyond the gatherings themselves. The wife is still there. Her title remains intact. Her role has not been formally altered. And yet, the structure of interaction has shifted around her, creating a reality in which she is no longer positioned at the point where influence naturally gathers. This is how isolation takes form in public, not through absence, through arrangement. She continued to appear at every gathering. Yet the spaces where influence truly formed had begun to unfold without her presence. Through private meetings and shifting attention, the court adjusted its focus, leaving her visible but no longer central to its movement. In that contrast, a quiet image began to settle, one that would define her not by her position, but by how far she now stood from where power gathered. The court remains full. Voices continue to rise and fall in a steady rhythm, woven together with the sound of music that never quite stops. Laughter appears at expected moments, controlled and measured, never too loud, never too quiet. Servants move between tables with practiced precision, carrying wine, adjusting plates, maintaining the illusion of seamless continuity. Nothing is missing, and yet, something no longer reaches her. She stands where she has always stood. Her place within the hall remains unchanged in form. Her presence is acknowledged with the same gestures. Inclined heads, brief greetings, and a recognition that is correct in every visible way. She is not ignored. She is not excluded. She is, in every formal sense, still part of the gathering. But she is no longer part of its movement. Conversations pass around her rather than through her. Words are exchanged within reach, yet do not extend toward her position. The flow of attention moves in patterns that feel complete without her involvement, as if the structure of the room has adjusted to function independently of her presence. She listens, but she is no longer responded to in the same way. When she speaks, the conversation does not expand. It acknowledges, then continues elsewhere, shifting direction with a subtlety that makes the change difficult to define. There is no interruption, no visible dismissal, only a quiet redirection that leaves her words contained within a smaller space than before. This containment repeats. Each interaction follows the same pattern. Recognition without engagement, presence without extension, participation without influence. These moments, taken individually, seem insignificant, but together, they create a condition that cannot be easily ignored. She is surrounded, but not connected. The music continues without pause. It fills the room, occupying the spaces between voices, smoothing over the gaps that might otherwise reveal disruption. It creates an atmosphere where everything feels whole, where nothing appears out of place. And within that atmosphere, her distance becomes less visible, absorbed into the larger movement of the court. This is what makes it effective. Her isolation does not stand apart from the environment. It is hidden within it. Those around her do not turn away. They simply turn elsewhere. Attention shifts with quiet precision, guided by proximity, by habit, by the new patterns that have settled into place. People gather where conversation feels active, where influence appears to move, where presence carries weight. And increasingly, that movement does not include her. She remains within sight, but not within focus. The difference is subtle, yet it alters everything. Because in a court where visibility defines importance, to be seen without being engaged is to exist without influence. Her presence becomes part of the setting, acknowledged, but not essential, included, but not required. No one intends harm. No one needs to. The structure itself now functions in a way that no longer depends on her. It continues smoothly, efficiently, as if nothing has been removed. And because nothing appears broken, there is no reason to repair it. She feels this change without being able to name it. There is no moment she can point to. No single event that explains what has shifted. Only a series of impressions. Conversations that do not reach her. Glances that do not settle. Moments that pass without connection. These impressions accumulate, forming a quiet awareness that something has moved beyond her control. And yet, she cannot respond. To do so would be to disrupt the composure she must maintain. To question the pattern would be to draw attention to something others treat as normal. And in doing so, she risks confirming a distance that has not been openly declared. So she remains still. She continues to stand within the same space, surrounded by the same people, under the same light that once reinforced her position. Nothing has changed in appearance. Everything has changed in effect. The court is full. The music continues. The gathering unfolds exactly as it should. But within that fullness, she exists alone. Not in absence, but in separation. A separation that does not require distance. Only the quiet absence of connection. The court remained crowded and alive. Yet her presence no longer connected her to the movement that surrounded her. Through repeated moments of recognition without engagement, she stood visible, but no longer part of the flow that carried influence. A quieter realization began to take hold, that being surrounded did not mean she was no longer alone. Information rarely disappears. It arrives differently. The wife still receives messages. Reports continue to reach her chambers. Conversations are repeated. Decisions are summarized. And events are described with enough detail to appear complete. Nothing, at first glance, suggests that anything has been withheld. And yet, something is no longer aligned. Timing begins to shift. News that once reached her at the moment it formed now arrives after it has already settled elsewhere. A discussion is mentioned only once it has concluded. A decision is explained rather than presented, framed as something that has already moved beyond reconsideration. The difference is slight, but persistent. She is informed, but not included. This delay alters more than awareness. It alters influence. Because to hear something after it has already been decided is not to participate in its formation. It is to receive it as fact, detached from the process that shaped it. Her voice, once part of that process, now enters too late to affect its direction. The shift is gradual. A single delay can be dismissed. An isolated omission can be explained. But repetition changes interpretation. What once appeared accidental begins to form a pattern, and that pattern begins to define her position within the flow of information. She continues to listen, but she is no longer at the point where information originates. At the same time, what reaches her is not always complete. Details are softened. Context is adjusted. Certain elements are emphasized while others are left unspoken. The message remains coherent, but its structure has been altered in ways that are difficult to detect without comparison. And comparison is no longer available, because the sources she once relied on have changed. Those who carry information to her do so carefully. They speak with precision, choosing what to include and what to leave aside. Their words are measured, their tone consistent, their delivery controlled. Nothing appears false. And yet, something within the message feels incomplete. This incompleteness is subtle. It does not disrupt understanding entirely. It reshapes it. She forms conclusions based on what she receives, unaware that those conclusions are built on a narrowed frame. Decisions that once felt certain now carry a faint hesitation. Reactions that once aligned with the broader court now feel slightly out of step, as if she is responding to something that no longer exists in the same form. This is how misalignment begins, not through deception that can be identified, through variation that cannot be easily proven. Meanwhile, conversations continue elsewhere. They unfold in rooms she does not enter, between people who no longer rely on her presence to proceed. These discussions are not hidden, but they are not directed toward her. They exist within a flow of information that moves independently, forming conclusions that reach her only once they are no longer subject to change. She hears of them, but she does not shape them. Over time, this separation grows. The distance between what she knows and what is actually occurring widens, though never enough to create a clear break. She remains aware, but not fully informed. She remains involved, but not directly engaged. The illusion of participation is maintained, even as the reality shifts. This illusion is important, because it prevents immediate recognition. If information were removed entirely, the absence would be obvious. If messages stopped arriving, the disruption would be undeniable. But by maintaining the flow, altered, delayed, and adjusted, the system continues to function, just not in the same way. She adapts to this change without naming it. She relies on what she receives. She responds within the limits of her understanding. She maintains the composure expected of her, trusting that the structure around her remains intact. But the structure has already shifted. Control over information is not about possession. It is about timing, framing, and access. And when those elements are adjusted, influence follows. The wife does not lose her voice. She loses the moment when that voice matters. Decisions move forward without her, shaped by conversations she does not hear, influenced by perspectives she does not encounter. By the time she responds, the direction has already been set, and her response becomes a reaction rather than guidance. This transition is not announced. It is experienced, through small delays, through incomplete details, through the quiet realization that what she knows no longer aligns fully with what others act upon. And in that realization, something essential begins to slip beyond her reach. Not taken, redirected. Information continued to reach her, yet its timing and structure had shifted in ways that quietly removed her from the moment where influence was formed. Through delay and subtle alteration, she remained informed, but no longer aligned with the decisions shaping the court around her. As that misalignment deepened, a quieter loss began to take hold, one where knowing no longer meant controlling what came next. Distance, when it reaches beyond space and information, begins to settle into something more difficult to measure. It becomes emotional. The wife is not removed from the king's presence. She is still seen beside him in public, still acknowledged within the structure that defines their bond. Nothing in their position suggests separation. Nothing in their appearance invites concern. And yet, something in their connection begins to change. The shift does not begin with conflict. It begins with interpretation. Small moments are noticed, then reframed. A pause in conversation becomes reluctance. A measured response becomes coldness. A silence, once understood as composure, is quietly reinterpreted as distance. These changes are not presented as accusations. They are offered as impressions, as subtle, uncertain, and difficult to challenge. The king does not hear criticism. He hears a suggestion, a remark made gently, almost in passing, that the wife seems less approachable than before, an observation that she appears withdrawn, perhaps burdened by concerns she does not share. A question, carefully phrased, about whether she still engages with the same warmth that once defined her presence. None of these statements demands agreement. They invite consideration, and once considered, they begin to influence perception. The king's interactions with his wife remain outwardly unchanged, yet his attention begins to shift. He listens differently. He observes more closely. He notices pauses that might once have passed without meaning. He interprets silence with a new awareness, one that looks for distance rather than composure. This awareness alters the tone between them. Conversations become shorter, not because they are forced to end, but because they no longer extend naturally. The ease that once allowed words to move freely between them begins to tighten, replaced by a careful exchange that remains correct, yet restrained. Nothing is said directly. Nothing needs to be. The absence of ease becomes its own message. At the same time, an alternative impression is formed elsewhere. The mistress, or those aligned with her, is described not through direct comparison, but through contrast that is never explicitly stated. She is approachable. She listens easily. She responds without hesitation. Her presence feels open, unguarded, and immediate. These qualities are not exaggerated. They are highlighted. And in being highlighted, they create a difference that does not require explanation. The king begins to experience two forms of interaction, one that feels measured and distant, and another that feels accessible and responsive. He does not choose immediately. He adjusts gradually. Moments of private conversation with his wife become less frequent. Opportunities for shared reflection are replaced by shorter exchanges. The space that once allowed for personal connection begins to narrow, not through refusal, but through absence. And in that absence, something essential is lost. The wife feels this change without understanding its origin. She senses that something in their interaction has shifted, that the rhythm between them no longer holds the same ease. But there is no moment she can point to, no clear reason she can confront. The change is not defined. It is experienced. So she adjusts. She becomes more careful in her words, more deliberate in her tone. She seeks to maintain the composure expected of her, to preserve stability within a connection that no longer responds in the same way. But this adjustment only reinforces the impression that has already begun to form. Her restraint appears as distance. Her control appears as withdrawal. Her silence appears as an absence. And because these interpretations have already been introduced, they settle more easily into place. The most effective aspect of this shift is that it removes the possibility of correction. The wife cannot respond to what has not been stated. She cannot defend against what has not been claimed. To question the change would be to acknowledge it. And in doing so, she risks confirming the very impression she cannot fully define. So she remains composed. She continues to stand within the structure of her role, maintaining the same presence, the same discipline, the same measured interaction that once ensured her position. But the meaning of that presence has changed, and she no longer controls how it is received. The connection between them does not break. It thins, and in that thinning, the space once filled by shared understanding begins to empty, leaving behind a form that appears intact, yet no longer holds the same depth. This is how emotional isolation takes form, not through rejection, through reinterpretation. Their connection remained visible, yet the ease that once defined it had been quietly replaced by a distance that neither of them openly named. Through subtle suggestions and shifting perception, she came to be seen as distant, while another presence appeared more open and immediate. As that contrast settled in, a deeper separation began to grow, one that would slowly replace closeness with something far more fragile. Ambition does not need to be created. It only needs to be recognized. Within the court, it exists quietly in almost every figure, sometimes visible in posture, sometimes hidden beneath restraint, but always present. It shapes how people listen, how they respond, and how they position themselves in relation to power. And once it is understood, it becomes something that can be guided without ever appearing to be controlled. The wife's allies are not immune to it. They may appear loyal, consistent, and aligned with her presence, but their loyalty exists alongside other considerations, such as family advancement, personal security, and future opportunity. These motivations do not contradict their support. They coexist with it, forming a balance that can shift when circumstances change. This balance is where influence begins to move. No one approaches them directly with an offer that could be refused. Instead, opportunities appear. A relative is considered for a position that had not been available before. A family member is mentioned in connection with a future appointment. A small favor is granted, not large enough to attract attention, but significant enough to be remembered. Each gesture is subtle, framed as recognition rather than exchange. Nothing is demanded. Everything is implied. The ally does not feel pressured. They feel acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, their position begins to adjust. They do not withdraw from their wives immediately. They continue to stand near her, to speak with her, to maintain the appearance of alignment. But something within their behavior changes. Their support becomes measured. Their involvement becomes selective. They begin to consider not only what benefits her, but what secures their own position within a shifting court. This consideration introduces hesitation. Hesitation alters action. A conversation that once would have been defended is now allowed to pass without response. A remark that might have been corrected is left unchallenged. A decision that affects her is observed, but not influenced. Each moment of restraint appears reasonable, even prudent, and because it appears reasonable, it is repeated. Over time, these repeated choices create a new form of alignment. The ally does not become an opponent. They become neutral. Neutrality, in this context, is not passive. It is strategic. It allows them to remain connected to both sides without fully committing to either. It protects their position, preserves their options, and reduces risk. And because this position offers stability, it becomes increasingly difficult to abandon. The wife senses the change, not through open betrayal, but through absence. Her allies are still present, yet they no longer act with the same certainty. Their words carry less weight. Their support arrives less often. Their presence, once a source of reinforcement, begins to feel conditional, as if it depends on circumstances she does not control. She cannot accuse them. There is nothing to accuse. They have not turned against her. They have simply adjusted their position within the court, responding to opportunities that appear both natural and advantageous. To question their choices would be to challenge their judgment, to risk appearing unreasonable in a space where adaptability is expected. So she remains silent. And in that silence, the shift continues. What makes this process particularly effective is that it does not disrupt the structure immediately. The network still exists. The same people remain within it, but their function changes. They no longer reinforce her position with the same consistency. They no longer carry her influence outward with the same strength. They observe. They wait. They choose carefully when to act. And in that carefulness, the network weakens, because influence depends not only on presence, but on certainty. It requires allies who act without hesitation, who extend support without calculating its cost. Once calculation replaces instinct, even the strongest connections begin to lose their force. The court adapts to this change. Those who observe begin to recognize the shift in alignment. They notice who speaks less, who intervenes less, and who remains present but no longer engaged. These observations shape their own behavior, encouraging further caution, further neutrality, further distance. The effect expands, not through confrontation. Through quiet agreement, the wife remains surrounded, but the meaning of that presence has changed. She stands among those who once acted on her behalf, yet now act with restraint, guided by considerations that no longer place her at the center of their decisions. Her network has not been broken. It has been balanced. And in that balance, her influence no longer moves as it once did, because ambition, once engaged, does not reverse easily. It continues to seek advantage, to align itself with what appears stable, to move toward what promises continuity. And as it does, it reshapes the structure around her. One decision at a time, her allies remained near, yet their actions had begun to follow their own interests rather than her position. Through quiet favors and implied opportunities, loyalty shifted into caution, and support became something that was no longer certain. From that growing caution, a bigger change began to unfold, one where presence remained, but allegiance no longer moved in the same direction. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with raised voices or visible conflict. It does not declare its presence through sudden rupture or open defiance. Instead, it settles quietly into relationships that once felt certain, altering them in ways that are difficult to recognize at first. It begins where trust once existed, not in opposition, but in familiarity. The people closest to the wife do not change all at once. They continue to stand near her, to speak with her, to move within the same spaces that once defined their connection. Nothing in their presence suggests distance. Nothing indicates that their loyalty has been broken. And yet, something no longer holds. A hand that once reached without hesitation now pauses. A glance that once remained steady now shifts away. A promise that once carried certainty is no longer repeated. These changes are small, too small to confront, too subtle to define. Each moment can be explained. A distraction, a concern, a necessity that requires attention elsewhere. No single action suggests betrayal. No individual gesture demands recognition. But together, they begin to form a pattern that cannot be easily ignored. The wife senses this pattern before she understands it. She notices the hesitation, the slight delay before agreement, the absence of the instinctive responses that once defined her relationships. Conversations continue, but they feel measured. Support remains, but it arrives with conditions that were never spoken of before. She cannot name the change, because nothing has been said. Those around her do not oppose her. They do not challenge her position. They do not withdraw in ways that could be described as disloyal. They remain present, maintaining the appearance of alignment, while adjusting their behavior in ways that create distance without declaration. This is what makes it difficult to resist. There is no enemy, only absence. The absence of certainty, the absence of immediacy, the absence of the unspoken understanding that once allowed her network to function without effort. These absences accumulate. They reshape how interaction unfolds, replacing instinct with calculation, replacing familiarity with caution. Those who once acted without hesitation now consider their position more carefully, weighing each decision against shifting circumstances that do not require explanation. Their loyalty has not disappeared. It has been reconsidered. And in that reconsideration, something essential is lost. Because loyalty, once measured, is no longer the same. It becomes conditional. It becomes responsive. It becomes something that can be adjusted rather than something that can be relied upon. The wife remains within these relationships. She continues to engage, to speak, to maintain the composure expected of her. But the responses she receives no longer carry the same weight. Words are returned, but without reinforcement. Agreement is offered, but without extension. Presence remains, but without commitment. She is not abandoned. She is surrounded by people who no longer act as they once did. This difference is difficult to confront. To accuse them would be to accuse what has not been declared. To question their loyalty would be to challenge relationships that, on the surface, remain intact. And in doing so, she risks appearing unstable, misreading what others treat as normal adjustment. So she remains silent. And in that silence, the change continues. What once felt like certainty becomes something fragile, something that can shift without warning. The network that once supported her does not collapse. It adapts, guided by considerations that no longer place her at the center of every decision. The most unsettling part is that no single moment defines this transformation. There is no clear beginning, no visible turning point, only a gradual movement away from what once existed, carried forward by choices that appear reasonable, justified, and necessary within the structure of the court. And because each choice is made quietly, the result feels inevitable, not forced, but accepted. This is how betrayal takes form when it is not declared. Not as an act, but as a series of adjustments that leave behind something that no longer resembles what it once was. Nothing had been openly broken, yet the certainty that once held her relationships together had begun to dissolve in ways she could not clearly name. Through hesitation, shifting glances, and promises that were no longer repeated. Those closest to her remained present while quietly changing their alignment. In that quiet transformation, a deeper truth began to emerge, that the greatest loss does not come from enemies, but from those who no longer stand the same way beside you. Form remains long after function has shifted. The wife continues to appear where she is expected to be seen. She enters the hall at the appointed time, her presence marked by the same gestures of acknowledgement that once carried weight. She stands beside the king during ceremonies, participates in rituals that define the court's structure, and fulfills every visible requirement of her role. Nothing has been taken from her. Everything has been preserved. And yet, something essential no longer moves through that preservation. Her position becomes ceremonial, not removed, redefined. The rituals she participates in continue with precision. Each movement is measured, each action aligned with expectation. She performs her role without deviation, maintaining the composure that has always been required of her. Observers see continuity. They see stability. They see a structure that remains intact. But they do not see influence. Because influence no longer passes through her in the same way. Decisions are still made within the court. Conversations still shape outcomes. Alliances continue to form and adjust. Yet these processes unfold without her direct involvement. She is informed, sometimes after the fact, sometimes in ways that acknowledge her position without granting her participation. She is present, but not included. The distinction is subtle. It does not disrupt the appearance of order. It does not challenge the structure that places her beside the king. Instead, it creates a separation between visibility and function, allowing her to remain at the center of the ceremony while moving her away from the center of influence. This separation is carefully maintained. She is not excluded from public events. On the contrary, her presence is emphasized. She is seen more clearly, positioned in ways that highlight her role within the formal structure of the court. Her image becomes part of the display, consistent, controlled, and unmistakable. But this visibility serves a different purpose. It replaces involvement. By placing her firmly within the ceremonial space, The court ensures that her role remains defined by appearance rather than action. She is seen fulfilling her duties. Yet those duties no longer extend into the areas where decisions are shaped. Her authority is not denied. It is contained within ritual, within form, within the boundaries that define what she represents rather than what she does. This containment creates a new kind of presence, one that is stable, predictable, and safe. Safe because it does not interfere. Safe because it does not challenge. Safe because it exists within limits that cannot be easily crossed without disrupting the very structure that supports it. The wife feels this shift without being able to oppose it. There is no moment where her authority is taken. No event marks the transition from influence to symbol. Instead, the change unfolds through repetition. Each ceremony reinforces her role. Each appearance confirms her position. And with each confirmation, the boundaries of that position become more defined, more visible, more restricted. She continues to stand beside the king. But the space between them carries a different meaning. It is no longer a space of shared influence, where conversation extends beyond form into decision. It becomes a space of representation, where proximity signals unity without requiring participation. The court responds accordingly. Those who observe her no longer seek her input in the same way. They do not approach her with the same expectation of influence. Her presence is respected, but not relied upon. Her role is acknowledged, but not extended into the areas where movement occurs. She becomes a constant, and in becoming a constant, she ceases to shape change. What makes this transformation especially effective is that it does not diminish her in appearance. She remains dignified. She remains visible. She remains, in every formal sense, exactly where she has always been. But the meaning of that position has been altered. It no longer carries the same reach. It no longer extends beyond the boundaries of ceremony. And because the structure remains intact, there is no disruption to challenge, no absence to question, no loss that can be clearly defined, only a quiet redefinition of purpose. The wife is no longer removed from the court. She is absorbed into its image, an image that reflects stability, continuity, and order. But beneath that image, her ability to act, to influence, to shape the direction of the court has already been replaced by something else. Something that does not require her to do anything at all, only to remain where she is, and be seen. Her presence remained carefully preserved. Yet the influence that once moved through her had been quietly contained within ritual and appearance. Through repeated ceremony and controlled visibility, she became a figure that represented stability rather than one who shaped it. As that transformation settled, a deeper realization began to form, that a position could remain unchanged while its power had already been taken away. Perception does not need to be changed completely. It only needs to be adjusted. The wife continues to appear before the court, as she always has. Composed, measured, and controlled. Her movements remain precise. Her expressions restrained. Her voice steady. Nothing in her behavior deviates from what is expected of her position. Nothing suggests that she has altered herself in response to what surrounds her. And yet, the way she is seen begins to shift. Not through accusation, through framing. Her composure, once understood as strength, is quietly described as distance. Her restraint, once respected, becomes interpreted as coldness. The same qualities that once reinforced her position are now observed through a different lens. One that does not deny them, but redefines their meaning. No one declares this openly. It emerges in conversation. A remark is made, gently, that she does not seem as approachable as before. An observation follows, suggesting that her presence carries a certain formality that others may find difficult to engage with. These statements are not repeated with insistence. They are offered lightly, as impressions rather than conclusions. And because they are light, they travel easily. Those who hear them do not reject them. They consider, they begin to notice the same qualities. Now interpreted differently, what was once invisible becomes visible, not because it has changed, but because attention has been directed toward it in a new way. At the same time, another image is shaped alongside hers. The mistress is not described as superior. She is described as different. Her presence is presented as warm, responsive, and immediate. She listens without hesitation. She speaks with ease. She appears to move within conversation rather than around it. These qualities are not exaggerated. They are highlighted, repeated, and allowed to stand in quiet contrast to the image that now surrounds the wife. The comparison is never stated directly. It does not need to be, because once both images exist within the same space, the contrast forms naturally. Observers begin to place them side by side, not through instruction, but through perception. One appears composed and distant. The other appears accessible and engaged. This contrast begins to guide attention. Those who seek ease move toward what feels open. Those who value responsiveness gravitate toward what appears immediate. The wife remains respected, but the instinct to approach her begins to weaken, replaced by a preference for interactions that feel less measured, less controlled. The court does not reject her. It redirects itself. This redirection is reinforced through repetition. Each gathering presents the same contrast. Each interaction confirms it. The wife remains consistent. Yet that consistency now carries a different meaning. The mistress remains present. Her qualities repeated until they become expected, until they begin to define what engagement should feel like. Over time, expectation replaces interpretation. The wife is no longer seen as composed. She is seen as distant. The mistress is no longer seen as different. She is seen as preferable. These shifts are subtle, but they carry weight. In a court where perception shapes alignment, how someone is seen determines how others behave around them. The wife's presence begins to invite formality rather than familiarity. Conversations remain controlled. Interactions remain limited. She is approached with respect, but not with ease. This difference alters her position, not visibly. Functionally, she is still at the center of the ceremony, still acknowledged within the structure of the court. But the movement of attention, the flow of conversation, the instinct to engage, all begin to move elsewhere, and as they do, her influence narrows, contained within the boundaries that her image now defines. She cannot correct this image, because it is not false. It is incomplete. To respond would be to confirm that there is something to respond to. To adjust her behavior would risk disrupting the composure that has always defined her role. And in doing so, she might reinforce the very contrast that now shapes perception. So she remains unchanged. And in remaining unchanged, she becomes easier to redefine. This is how an image is used as a tool, not to replace reality, to reinterpret it. The wife continues to stand before the court as she always has. Nothing in her presence has altered. And yet, everything about how that presence is received has been quietly transformed, guided by comparison, reinforced through repetition, and accepted without question, because once perception settles, it becomes difficult to reverse. And once contrast defines understanding, it reshapes where attention naturally gathers. Her behavior remained the same, yet the way it was interpreted had been quietly reframed through repeated comparison and suggestion. In contrast with a more approachable presence, she came to be seen as distant, even as she continued to act as she always had. A different image began to take hold, one that would guide attention away from her without ever removing her from view. Replacement does not begin with removal. It begins with formation. The wife's network does not need to be dismantled completely to lose its power. It only needs to be matched, then slowly outpaced, by something that appears equally stable, equally natural, and ultimately more aligned with the shifting center of influence. New figures begin to gather, not suddenly, and not in ways that invite attention. They appear gradually, entering the court through familiar paths: marriage, introduction, and recommendation. Each arrival seems ordinary, justified by circumstance, supported by reasons that require no further explanation. No one questions their presence. At first, they do not form a group. They exist separately. A new lady appears at a gathering, speaking with ease, drawing attention through her responsiveness rather than her position. Another is introduced within a different circle, her presence noted but not emphasized. A third becomes familiar over time, her face appearing more often, her interactions more frequent. Individually, they carry little weight. Together, they begin to create a pattern. They are seen in the same spaces. They attend the same smaller gatherings. They speak with the same people. Their presence overlaps, not by design that can be identified, but through repetition that becomes difficult to ignore. And as this overlap continues, it begins to form a network, not declared, recognized. This network gathers around a different center. The mistress does not claim authority over it. She does not direct it openly, but her presence aligns with it. Her interactions, reinforcing its cohesion. Those within the group respond to her with ease, with familiarity, with a kind of immediate engagement that contrasts with the measured structure surrounding the wife. This difference shapes behavior. Those who enter these spaces find interaction more fluid, more responsive, less constrained by formality. Conversations extend without hesitation. Attention moves freely. Presence feels active rather than contained. And because this experience repeats, it begins to define expectation. The new network grows, not through expansion that disrupts the court, but through accumulation that integrates into it. More figures align themselves with this group, drawn not by instruction, but by the movement of attention and the promise of connection that feels less restricted. The court adapts. Observers begin to recognize this network as a place where influence gathers, not formally, not officially, but in practice. Those who wish to remain relevant position themselves within or near it, adjusting their alignment to reflect where activity now occurs. This adjustment does not require abandoning the wife. It only requires dividing attention. And in that division, the balance begins to shift. The wife's network remains. It continues to function, to appear stable, to carry the same structure that once defined its strength. But its movement slows. Its interactions feel more contained. Its presence, while still visible, no longer draws the same level of engagement. Meanwhile, the new network operates with increasing cohesion. Its members reinforce each other's presence. Their interactions create continuity. Their repeated alignment forms a structure that begins to mirror, then replace, the one that once centered around the wife. This replacement is not announced. It is experienced through repeated gatherings, through consistent interaction, through the gradual recognition that one network feels more active, more connected, more aligned with where influence now resides. Over time, this recognition reshapes the court's social order. What once felt central becomes formal. What once carried movement becomes contained. And what once appeared secondary begins to define the direction in which attention flows. The wife remains within the structure. Her position is unchanged. Her network still exists, but it no longer defines the court. A new arrangement has taken shape around her, one that operates alongside her presence without depending on it. And because it functions effectively, because it feels natural, because it offers a form of interaction that others respond to, it begins to replace what came before. not through force, through preference. The most unsettling aspect of this transformation is that it does not require the wife to lose anything visibly. She remains where she has always been, surrounded by those who still acknowledge her, supported by a structure that still appears intact. And yet, the center has moved, away from her, towards something that has been formed quietly, reinforced through repetition, and accepted without declaration. Because once a new network exists, and once that network begins to carry influence more effectively, the old one does not need to be removed. It simply becomes less necessary. Her network remained intact in appearance, yet a new one had begun to form beside it, drawing attention and interaction in ways that felt more immediate and alive. Through repeated gatherings and shared presence, this emerging circle redefined where influence naturally gathered within the court. That shift began to settle into something more permanent, a new order that no longer required her to remain at its center. Power does not always move through proclamation. It often shifts through recognition. The court continues as it always has. Ceremonies are held, gatherings unfold, and the structure that defines rank and position remains intact. Nothing is announced. No decree is issued. No visible change suggests that anything has been altered within the hierarchy that governs the court. And yet, something no longer aligns with what it appears to be. The wife remains in place. She stands where she has always stood, occupies the same position, and fulfills the same role. Her presence is acknowledged with the same gestures. Her title unchanged. Her proximity to power still visible. To an observer, nothing suggests that her status has diminished. But recognition begins to shift. Those who once looked toward her for direction now hesitate. Their attention does not settle in the same way. When decisions are discussed, their responses form around a different center, guided by signals that are not spoken, yet clearly understood. These signals appear in small moments. A nod given in one direction rather than another. A pause before agreement, followed by alignment elsewhere. A glance exchanged that confirms understanding without requiring words. Each moment is brief, but they repeat, and through repetition, they begin to define a new pattern. No one declares that authority has moved. They respond as if it already has. This response reshapes behavior. Those within the court begin to adjust their alignment, not because they are instructed to do so, but because they recognize where influence now gathers. They follow attention. They respond to presence. They position themselves in relation to what feels active, rather than what appears fixed. The wife remains visible, but visibility no longer determines influence. The distinction between form and function becomes clearer with each interaction. She continues to represent stability, continuity, and order. Her role remains intact within the structure that defines the court. But the movement that shapes decisions, the energy that directs conversation, the recognition that signals authority, these begin to occur elsewhere. This transition does not create conflict, because nothing has been taken directly. There is no moment where authority is removed, no event that marks the transfer of influence. Instead, the shift occurs through behavior, through the way people respond, the way they listen, the way they align themselves within the space. And because behavior changes gradually, the transition feels natural. Inevitably, the wife cannot challenge this shift. There is nothing to confront. Her position has not been altered. Her role has not been reduced. The structure around her remains unchanged. To question what is happening would be to question something that has not been declared, something that exists only in the movement of attention and the responses of those around her. So she remains within the structure. She continues to perform her role, to maintain the composure expected of her, to occupy the space that still belongs to her in form. But the meaning of that space has changed, and she cannot restore what has already moved beyond her reach. The court accepts this change without discussion. No one needs to explain it. because it is understood, through repeated gestures, through consistent alignment, through the quiet recognition that authority no longer flows in the same direction. A new order takes shape. It does not replace the old one openly. It exists alongside it, gradually becoming the structure that defines how influence operates. Over time, the difference becomes clear. The wife remains where she has always been, but the decisions that shape the court no longer move through her. This is how power changes hands when it is not declared. Not through command, through recognition. Nothing had been announced. Yet the way people responded began to reveal that authority no longer rested where it once had. Through quiet gestures and shifting alignment, the court adjusted itself without ever acknowledging that anything had changed. A new reality had begun to take hold, one where power no longer needed to be declared to be recognized. The change does not remain outside her. It begins to settle within. Nothing in the court demands that she doubt herself. No one speaks directly against her. No accusation is placed before her that requires defense. And yet, the absence of what once surrounded her begins to take form as something she can no longer ignore. Confidence does not disappear at once. It thins. At first, the difference is almost unnoticeable. A moment of hesitation before speaking. A pause where certainty once existed. A brief reconsideration of words that would once have been offered without thought. These are small adjustments. Easily explained. Easily dismissed. But they repeat. And repetition changes meaning. The wife begins to measure herself in ways she never needed to before. She considers not only what she says, but how it might be received. She watches for reactions that once came naturally, now searching for signs that confirm or deny something she cannot fully define. Her awareness increases. Her certainty decreases. This imbalance creates tension, because the more she observes, the more she notices what is no longer there. Conversations that do not extend. Responses that feel restrained. Moments that pass without the reinforcement she once relied upon. Each absence, taken alone, too, is insignificant. Together, they form a pattern that begins to shape her perception of herself. She does not question the court. She questions her place within it. This is where isolation becomes internal, not imposed, absorbed. The network that once carried her presence has shifted, and in its absence, she begins to rely on her own interpretation to understand what surrounds her. But that interpretation is shaped by incomplete information, by altered perception, by the quiet distance that now defines her interactions. Uncertainty grows. She revisits conversations, searching for meaning that may not exist. She replays moments, examining tone, expression, timing, and details that once required no attention. What was once instinctive becomes deliberate. What was once clear becomes uncertain. This uncertainty does not remain contained. It influences behavior. She becomes more cautious in her speech, choosing words with greater care. She avoids statements that might be misinterpreted, reduces engagement in conversations that feel unpredictable, and withdraws slightly from interactions that no longer offer the same sense of stability. These adjustments feel protective, but they are limiting, because in reducing her presence, she reinforces the perception that has already begun to form. Her caution appears as distance. Her restraint appears as hesitation. The qualities that once defined her control now begin to suggest uncertainty. The court responds to this change, not openly, but consistently. Those who observe her behavior begin to interpret it through the lens that has already been established. Her reduced engagement confirms the impression of withdrawal. Her measured responses reinforce the idea that she is no longer as certain, as present, as connected as before. This creates a cycle. Perception influences behavior. Behavior reinforces perception. And within that cycle, her position continues to shift. The most dangerous aspect of this transformation is that it produces visible error. Not immediately, but inevitably. A moment arrives where hesitation leads to misjudgment. A delay in response causes her to miss the direction of a conversation. A choice, made without full awareness of the context, places her slightly out of alignment with those around her. These moments are small, but they are seen. And once seen, they are remembered, not as isolated incidents, as confirmation. Confirmation that something has changed. The wife cannot fully correct these errors, because they are not caused by a lack of ability, but by a shift in the environment that she can no longer control. She responds to what she perceives, yet what she perceives is no longer complete. And in that gap, misalignment becomes unavoidable. Her composure remains. Her position remains. But the confidence that once allowed her to move without hesitation begins to dissolve, replaced by a carefulness that limits rather than strengthens her presence. This is how isolation completes its effect, not by removing her from the court, but by altering how she moves within it. She remains visible, but she no longer moves with the same certainty. And in a court where certainty defines influence, that difference is enough to reshape everything. Nothing had been taken from her directly, yet the absence around her had begun to reshape how she saw herself and how she acted. Through hesitation and growing uncertainty, her behavior shifted in ways that quietly reinforced the distance others already perceived. That shift began to reveal something more fragile, that once confidence fades, even the smallest misstep can change how everything is seen. Time, when used carefully, becomes a form of control. No single moment defines the outcome. No decisive act determines the result. Instead, change is distributed across days, across small adjustments that never demand immediate attention. Each one appears minor, easily absorbed into the rhythm of the court, until the accumulation begins to shape something that no longer resembles what once existed. The strategy does not aim for a sudden victory. It avoids it, because sudden change invites resistance. It creates clarity, draws attention, and forces alignment. A visible shift can be challenged, questioned, or even reversed, but a gradual one dissolves into habit, becoming part of what feels natural, expected, and inevitable. This is how isolation is sustained, not through force, through persistence. The wife does not experience a single loss. She experiences many small ones. A conversation that does not reach her, a gathering that proceeds without her involvement, a decision that is presented after it has already been shaped. Each moment, on its own, is manageable. It can be explained, ignored, or accepted. But together, they begin to alter her position, not by removing her from the structure, but by redefining how that structure functions around her. The pace is controlled. Nothing happens too quickly. There is always time for adjustment, for normalization, for acceptance. Each change is given space to settle before the next begins. This spacing prevents recognition. It allows the court to adapt gradually, aligning itself with a new pattern without ever acknowledging that a transition has occurred. The wife remains within the system. She continues to perform her role, to move through the same spaces, to maintain the same presence that once ensured her influence. Nothing demands that she step away. Nothing requires her to confront what is happening. And because nothing requires confrontation, nothing is confronted. This absence of conflict is essential. It creates the impression that nothing has been taken, that no loss has occurred, that the structure remains intact. The wife still holds her title. She still occupies her place. She is still recognized in every formal sense. But recognition alone does not sustain influence. Influence requires movement, and movement has been redirected. Over time, the wife begins to adjust to this redirection. She adapts to the delays, to the distance, to the altered patterns of interaction. that now define her experience within the court. What once felt unfamiliar begins to feel expected. What once seemed unusual becomes routine. This is how erosion becomes invisible. Because once something is accepted as normal, it is no longer questioned. The court, too, adapts. Those who observe the wife no longer compare her current position to what it once was. They respond only to what is present. Her reduced influence does not appear as a loss. It appears as her natural state, as if it had always been this way. This perception reinforces the change. It stabilizes it, and once stabilized, it becomes difficult to reverse. The wife cannot reclaim what has not been visibly taken. She cannot restore what has not been clearly lost. The absence of a defined moment of change prevents her from identifying a point of resistance. There is no event to challenge. No decision to undo. No single action to correct. Only a condition. A condition that has formed over time, shaped by repetition, reinforced by acceptance, and maintained through the quiet alignment of those around her. This is what makes the strategy effective. It does not break the structure. It redefines it. The wife remains within a system that no longer responds to her in the same way. And because that system continues to function smoothly, there is no disruption to signal that anything has gone wrong. Her position is not removed. It is reinterpreted. And in that reinterpretation, her influence fades without ever appearing to be taken away. The most unsettling part is how natural it all seems, how easily the court continues, how seamlessly the transition settles into place, as if nothing has changed, even as everything has. Nothing had been taken from her at once. Yet the steady repetition of small changes had quietly reshaped her position over time. Through gradual adjustment and constant reinforcement, what once felt temporary became accepted as natural within the court. That acceptance allowed something final to take hold, a quiet collapse that no one could point to, yet no one could reverse. The end does not arrive as an event. It settles as a condition. The wife remains where she has always been. Her title is unchanged, her place still recognized, her presence still acknowledged within the structure that defines the court. Nothing, in appearance, suggests that she has lost anything at all. And yet, nothing that once sustained her remains the same. Her network has dissolved, not visibly, not suddenly, but completely. The people who once reinforced her presence no longer move in alignment with her. They remain within the court, continue to exist within the same structure. Yet their actions, their attention, their influence no longer extend toward her position. She is still surrounded, but she is no longer supported. The distinction is quiet, but absolute. Her presence no longer carries weight beyond itself. It does not extend through others, does not shape conversation, and does not influence decisions in the way it once did. The structure around her continues to function, but it no longer responds to her as its center. She remains within it, but she no longer directs it. This is what it means to lose everything without leaving, because nothing has been removed, only replaced. The court has adjusted to a new arrangement, one that operates smoothly, efficiently, and without disruption. Those within it no longer look toward her for direction. They respond to different signals, align themselves with different centers, and follow patterns that no longer include her influence. And because this adjustment has occurred gradually, it feels natural, expected, as if it had always been this way. The wife cannot point to a moment where the change occurred. There is no single event that defines her loss, no decision that can be reversed, no action that can be undone. Only a series of small shifts that have accumulated into something permanent. She stands where she has always stood, but the meaning of that place has changed. It is no longer a position of influence. It is a position of appearance. She is seen, but she is not followed. She is acknowledged, but she is not relied upon. Her role has been preserved in form, yet emptied of function, and because it remains visible, it continues to give the impression of stability, of continuity, of order. The court appears unchanged. The structure holds. The rituals continue. Everything moves as it should. Only the direction of power has shifted. Quietly, completely. The most unsettling part is that no one speaks of it. There is no acknowledgement of loss, no recognition of transition, no moment where the court pauses to consider what has happened. It continues, as it always has, absorbing the change into its rhythm until it becomes indistinguishable from what came before. And the wife, within this rhythm, becomes part of the image, a figure that represents what remains, rather than what moves. She does not fall. She fades, not from view, but from influence. And in that fading, her position becomes something else entirely. Something stable, something fixed, something that no longer carries the ability to shape what surrounds it, because the court no longer needs her to do so. It has already found another way. Her title remained, yet everything that once gave it meaning had already slipped beyond her reach. Through quiet replacement and gradual adjustment, her network dissolved while another structure took its place. That final realization settles gently. That power can leave without departure, and loss can exist without ever being seen. Good evening. If you are still here, still listening, then perhaps you have already begun to feel the quiet weight of this story settling in. There is something strangely unsettling about a loss that never announces itself. Something difficult to grasp about a change that leaves everything in place, yet alters everything beneath the surface. Stories like this do not end with a fall or a final moment of recognition. They end with a continuation. The court continues. The candles are lit again the next evening. Conversations resume, shaped by the same patterns that have already taken hold. The structure remains intact, steady, and composed, giving no sign that anything has been lost at all. And perhaps that is what makes it so difficult to notice. Because we are often taught to recognize power through what is visible, through titles, through positions, through proximity. We look for change in movement, in disruption, in moments that clearly divide what was from what is. But here, there is no division, only transition, a quiet, steady shift that moves through relationships, through perception, through the smallest adjustments in behavior, until what once existed is no longer present, even though nothing appears to have been taken away. It is easy to imagine that we would notice such a change, that we would recognize the moment something begins to slip, that we would resist it, or question it, hold on to what is being altered. But the truth, as this story shows, is often different. Change that arrives slowly does not feel like change at all. It feels like time is passing. It feels like people are adjusting. It feels like something natural, something inevitable, something that does not demand attention because it never appears to cross a clear boundary. And by the time it can be seen clearly, it has already settled into place. There is no single moment to return to, no point at which everything can be restored, only a quiet awareness that something has shifted beyond reach. Perhaps that is why stories like this remain with us, not because of what happens, but because of how it happens, because they remind us that power does not always disappear in dramatic ways. It can fade. It can be redirected. It can be absorbed into structures that continue to function without ever acknowledging the change. And that realization, once understood, is difficult to forget. As you rest now, let that thought settle gently. There is no need to hold on to every detail, no need to follow every thread back to its origin. The story has already unfolded in the way it was meant to, and what remains is not the sequence of events, but the feeling they leave behind, A sense of stillness, a quiet recognition, a slow awareness that not all endings are visible. Let your thoughts move away from the court, from the halls, from the figures that once stood so clearly in place. Let them soften, becoming less defined, less structured, until they no longer require your attention. The story can remain where it is. You do not need to carry it further. There will always be more to explore, more histories to wander through, more quiet stories waiting to be uncovered. But for now, this one can come to rest, just as you can. So take a moment, let the silence return, let the rhythm slow, and allow yourself to drift gently away from the world you have been watching, into a place where nothing needs to be understood, nothing needs to be held, and nothing needs to be followed any further. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. Sleep well,